Hello, and welcome to our final readings of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Today I'll be reading you the last few chapters of Alice in Wonderland before we begin our journey into Oz later this week. So if you've missed any of the other recordings of Alice in Wonderland, please check back on our YouTube page or also on our Facebook page. We have videos of all the rest of my readings of Alice in Wonderland located there. So be sure to check that out. So without further ado, we're going to begin with Chapter 10, The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew back one of its flappers across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two sobs choked his voice. "As if he had a bone in his throat," said the Griffin, and it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last, the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears streaming down his cheek, he went on again. "You may not have lived much under the sea." "I haven't," said Alice. "And perhaps you were never introduced to a lobster," Alice began to say. "I once tasted," but checked herself hastily and said, "No, never." "So you can have no idea what a delightful thing the lobster quadrille is." "No, indeed," said Alice. "What sort of dance is it?" "Why," said the Griffin, "you first form a line along along at the seashore." "Two lines," cried the Mock Turtle. "Seals, turtles, salmon, and so on. Then, when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way—" "That generally takes some time," interrupted the Griffin. "You advance twice, each with a lobster as a partner," cried the Griffin. "And of course," the Mock Turtle said, "advance twice, set to partners, change lobsters, and retire in the same order," continued the Griffin. "Then, you know," the lobster went on, "you throw the lobsters!" shouted the Griffin with a bound into the air, "as far out to sea as you can." "Swim after them!" screamed the Griffin. "Turn a somersault in the sea!" cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about. "Change lobsters again!" yelled the Griffin at the top of his voice. "Back to land again, and that's all the first figure," said the Mock Turtle, suddenly dropping his voice. The two creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all the time, sat down very sadly and quietly and looked at Alice. "It must be a very pretty dance," said Alice timidly. "Why, would you like to see a little of it?" said the Mock Turtle. "Very much indeed." "Come, let us try the first figure," said the Mock Turtle to the Griffin. "We can do it without lobsters, you know. Shall we sing?" "Oh, you sing," said the Griffin. "I've forgotten the words." So they solemnly began to dance round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes as they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and very sadly. "Will you walk a little faster?" said the Whiting to the Snail. "There's a porpoise close behind us. He's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Would you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance?" You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with the lobsters out to sea." But the Snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. He said he thanked the Whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not join the dance. Would not, could not join the dance. "What matter is it far we go?" his scaly friend replied. "There's another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further from England, the nearer is to France. Now turn not pale, beloved Snail, and come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Will you, won't you join the dance?" "Thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch," said Alice, feeling very, very glad that it was over at last. And I do like that curious song about the whiting." "Oh, as to the whiting," said the Mock Turtle, you've seen them, of course." "Yes," said Alice. "I've often seen them at and she checked herself hastily. "I don't know where Din may be," said the Mock Turtle, "but if you've seen them so often, of course you know what they're like." "I believe so," Alice replied thoughtfully. "They have their tails in their mouths, and they're crumbs all over. And they're all over crumbs." "You're wrong about the crumbs," said the Mock Turtle. "Crumbs would wash off in the sea, but they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is—" Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes. "Tell her, the reason and all that," he said to the Griffin. "The reason is," the Griffin said, "that they would go with the lobsters to dance, so they've got thrown out to sea. So they've had to fall a long way. So they've got their tails fast in their mouths, so they couldn't get them out again. That's all." "Thank you," said Alice. "It's very interesting. I never knew so much about the whiting before." "I can tell you more than that if you'd like," said the Griffin. "Do you know why it's called a whiting?" "I've never thought about it," said Alice. "Why?" "It does the boots and shoes," the Griffin replied very solemnly. Alice was thoroughly puzzled. "Does the boots and shoes?" she repeated in a wandering tone. "Why, what are your shoes done with?" said the Griffin. "I mean, what makes them so shiny?" Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave an answer. "They're done with blacking, I believe." "Boots and shoes under the sea," said the Griffin, went on in a deep voice, "are done with whiting. Now you know." "And what are they made of?" asked Alice in a tone of great curiosity. "Soles and eels, of course," the Griffin replied rather impatiently. "Any shrimp could have told you that." "If I'd been the whiting," said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, "I'd have said to the porpoise, 'Keep back, please. I don't want you with us.'" "They are obliged to have him with them," the Mock Turtle said. "No wise fish would go anywhere without a porpoise." "Wouldn't it really?" said Alice in a tone of great surprise. "Of course not," said the Mock Turtle. "Why, if a fish came to me and told me it was going on a journey, I would say, 'With what porpoise?'" "Don't you mean purpose?" said Alice. "I mean what I say," the Mock Turtle replied in an offended tone. The Griffin added, "Come, let me hear some of your adventures." "I could tell you of my adventures, beginning from this morning," said Alice a little timidly, "but it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then." "Explain all of that." "No, no, the adventures first," said the Griffin in an impatient tone. Explanations take such a dreadful time." So Alice began to tell her of her adventures from the time when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it at the first. The two creatures had gotten so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide, but she gained the courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet until she got to the part about her repeating the "You are old Father William" to the caterpillar, and the words all coming out different, and the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said, "That's very curious." It's all about as curious as it can be," said the Griffin. It all came different," the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully. "I would like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin." He looked at the Griffin as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice. "Stand up and repeat, ''Tis the voice of a sluggard,'" said the Griffin. How the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons," thought Alice. "I might just as well be at school at once." However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying when the words came out very queer indeed. "'Tis the voice of a lobster," I heard him declare, "that you have baked me too brown and must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt, his buttons, and turns out his toes." "That's different from what I used to say when I was a child," said the Griffin. Well, I've never heard it before, said the Mock Turtle, but it sounds uncommon nonsense. Alice said nothing, and she sat down again with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would be in its natural way again. I should like to have it explained, said the Mock Turtle. She can't explain it, said the Gryphon hastily. Go on with the next verse. But what about his toes? The Mock Turtle persisted. How could he turn them out with his nose, you know? Isn't that the first position in dancing? Alice said, but it was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing and longed to change the subject. Go on with the next verse, the Gryphon repeated impatiently. It begins, I passed by his garden. Alice did not dare disobey, though she felt it sure would all come wrong, and she went on in a trembling voice. I have passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the oyster were sharing a pie. What is the use of repeating all that stuff? The Mock Turtle interrupted. If you don't explain it as you go on, it's by far the most confusing thing I've ever heard. Yes, but I think you'd better leave off, said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille? The Gryphon went on. Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song? Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind, Alice replied, so eagerly that the Gryphon said in a rather offended tone, No accounting for tastes. Sing her turtle soup, would you, old fellow? The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, in a voice sometimes choked with sobs, to sing this. Beautiful turtle soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. For such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give up 2 pennies worth only of beautiful soup? A penny's worth only of beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful, full soup. Chorus again, cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it when the cry of "The trial's beginning!" was heard in the distance. Come on, cried the Gryphon, and was taking Alice by the hand. It hurried off without waiting for the end of the song. The trial, is it? Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, Come on! And ran the faster, while more and more faintly came on the breeze that followed them the melancholy words, Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. All right. Hope you all enjoyed my singing there. All right, Chapter 11, Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled around them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as a whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side of him, and near the king was the white rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. It was in the very middle of the court was a table with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get the trial done, she thought, and hand around the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. That's the judge, she said to herself, because of his great wig. The judge, by the way, was the king, and he wore his crown over his wig. It looked like the frontispiece of... It looked at the frontispiece if you would want to see how he did it. He did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. And that's the cherry box, Alice thought, and all of those 12 creatures She was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some of them were birds. I suppose they are the jurors. She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it, for she thought, and rightly too, that the very few girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on their slates. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the Griffin. "They can't all have put anything to put down yet, before the trial's begun." "They're putting down their names," the Griffin whispered in reply, "for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Stupid things," Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but stopped herself hastily, for the White Rabbit cried out, "Silence in the court!" The king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously around to make out who was talking. Alice could see as well, if they were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down "stupid things" on their slates, and she couldn't make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. A nice muddle their slates'll be in before the trial's over, thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked, and this, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went around the court and got behind him, and was very soon found an opportunity to take it away. She did it so quickly that the poor juror, it was Bill the Lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it. So after hunting all about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and it was of very little use, and it left no mark on the slate. "Harold, read the accusation," said the king. On this, the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and unrolled the parchment scroll and read as follows. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all in a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quietly away." "Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury. "Not yet, not yet," the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "Call the first witness," said the king, and the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on his trumpet and called out, "First witness!" The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "I beg your pardon, your majesty," he began, "for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "You ought to have finished," the king said. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. 14th of March, I think it was." 15th, said the March Hare. 16th, said the Dormouse. "Write that down," the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. "Take off your hat," the king said to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," said the hat. "Stolen!" the king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. I keep them to sell," the Hatter added in explanation. "I've none of my own. I am a hatter." Here the queen put on her spectacles and began staring hard down at the Hatter, who had turned pale and fidgeted. "Give your evidence," said the king, "and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He began shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of his bread and butter. Just at this moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court, but on second thought she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her. "I do wish you wouldn't squeeze so," said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," Alice said meekly. "I'm growing." "You've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," said Alice more boldly. "You don't know you know you're growing too." "Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace," said the Dormouse, "not in that ridiculous fashion." He got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time, the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, and she said to one of the officers of the court, "Bring me the list of singers in the last concert," on which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook both his shoes off. "Give me your evidence," the king repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed whether you're nervous or not." "I am a poor man, your majesty," said the Hatter, began in a trembling voice, "and I haven't but just begun my tea, not above a week or so, but with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea." "The twinkling of what?" said the king. "It began with the tea," the Hatter replied. "Of course, twinkling begins with the tea," said the king sharply. "Do you take me for a dunce? Go on." "I am a poor man," the Hatter went on, "and most things twinkle after that." Only the March Hare said. "I didn't," said the March Hare, interrupted in a great hurry. "You did," said the Hatter. "I deny it," said the March Hare. "He denies it," the king says. "Leave out that part." "Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said," the Hatter went on, looking anxiously around to see if he would deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep. "After that," continued the Hatter, "I cut some more bread and butter." "What did the Dormouse say?" one of the jurymen asked. "I can't remember," said the Hatter. "You must remember," remarked the king, "or you'll be executed." The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee. "I am a poor man, your majesty," he began. "You are a very poor speaker," said the king. Here, one of the guinea pigs cheered, and was immediately suppressed by the officers of court. As that is a rather hard word to say, I will just explain to you how it was done. They had a large canvas bag which they tied up at the mouth with strings, and they slipped the guinea pig head first and then sat upon it. I'm glad I've seen that done," thought Alice. "I've so often read in newspapers at the end of trials there was an attempt at applause which was immediately suppressed by the officers of court. I never thought that's what it meant until now." "If that's all you know about it, you may stand down," continued the king. "I can go no lower," said the Hatter. "I am on the floor as it is." "Then you may sit down," the king replied. Here the other guinea pig cheered and was suppressed. "Come, that finishes the guinea pigs," thought Alice. "Now we shall get on better." "I'd rather finish my tea," said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the queen, who was reading the list of singers. "You may go," said the king, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court without even waiting to put his shoes on. "And just take his head off outside," said the queen, added to one of the officers, and the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. "Call the next witnesses," said the king. The next witness was the Duchess's cook, and she carried the pepper box in hand, and Alice guessed who it was even before she got into the court, by the way people near the door all began sneezing at once. The king looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, "Your Majesty, we must cross-examine this witness." "Well, if I must, I must," said the king with a melancholy air, and folded his arms and frowning at the cook until his eyes were nearly out of sight. He said in a deep voice, "What are those tarts made of?" "Pepper mostly," said the cook. "Treacle," said the sleepy voice behind her. "Collar that dormouse," the queen shrieked. "Behead that dormouse! Turn that dormouse out of court! Suppress him! Pinch him! Off with his whiskers!" For some minute the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. "Never mind," said the king with an air of great relief. "Call the next witness." He had added under his tone to the queen, "Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache." Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what would happen to what the next witness would be like, for they haven't gotten much evidence yet. she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his small little voice the name Alice! Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen onto their heads of the crowd below, and there they lay sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of a goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would all die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all of the jurymen are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, and began quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other." As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of the upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. "What to do about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatsoever?" persisted the king. "Nothing whatever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him all as he spoke. "Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king said hastily, and went about himself in an undertone, "important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if he were trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote it down important and some unimportant, and Alice could see this as she was near enough to look over at their slates, but it doesn't matter a bit, she thought to herself. At this moment, the king, who had called for some time, busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read from his book. "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high are to leave the court." Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. "There's more evidence to come yet, please your majesty," said the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What is in it?" said the queen. "I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, "unless it's written down to nobody, which isn't usual, you know." "Who is it directed to?" said one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the White Rabbit. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, "It isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" asked another juryman. "No, they're not," said the White Rabbit, "and it's the queerest thing about it." The jury all looked puzzled. "He must be intimidated by somebody else's hand," said the king. The jury all brightened up again. "Or it must be imitated somebody else's hand," said the king, and the jury brightened up again. "Please your majesty," said the knave, "I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end. if you didn't sign it," said the king. "That only makes it worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you've signed your name like an honest man." There was general clapping of hands at this, and the first really clever thing the king had said all day. "That proves his guilt," said the queen. "It proves nothing of the sort," said Alice. "Why, you don't even know what they're about." "Read them," the king said. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. "Where shall I begin, please your majesty?" he said. "Begin at the beginning," the king said gravely, "and go on until you've come to the end. Then stop." These were the verses the White Rabbit read. "They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. I sent the word that I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she pushed the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her one, they gave him two, they gave us three or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you the first to free exactly as they were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him, ourselves, and it. Don't let him know she liked him best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me." "That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet," the king said, rubbing his hands. "So let the jury, if any one of them can explain it," said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she had been a bit afraid of interrupting him. "I'll give him 6 pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." The jury all wrote down on their slates, "She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." And none of them attempted to explain the paper. "If there's no meaning in it," said the king, "that saves a world of trouble, you know. We needn't try to find it. And yet, I don't know," he went speaking on, spreading out the verse on one knee and looking at them with one eye. I've seemed to find some meaning in them after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?" he added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like it?" he said, which he certainly did not, being entirely made of cardboard. "All right so far," said the king, and he himself went on muttering over the verse himself. "We know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. I gave her one, they gave him two. Why, that must be what he did to the tarts, you know." And goes on, "They all returned him to you." "But it goes on, they've all returned from him to you," said Alice. Why, there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. "Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit, you've never had fits, my dear, I think." This he said to the queen. "Never," said the queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had let off writing on his slate with one finger as he found it made no mark, but now he hastily began again, using the ink that trickled down his face as long as it lasted. "Then the words don't fit you," said the king, looking around the court with a smile. There was a dead silence. "It's a pun," the king added in a very angry tone, and everybody laughed. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the king said, for the 20th time that day. "No, no," said the queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." "Stuff and nonsense," said Alice loudly. "The idea of having a sentence first." "Hold your tongue," said the queen, turning purple. "I won't," said Alice. "Off with her head," the queen shouted at the top of her voice, and nobody moved. "Who cares for you?" said Alice, as she had grown to her full size by this time. "You are nothing but a pack of cards." At this, the whole pack rose into the air and came flying down upon her, and she gave a little scream, half of fright, half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on a bank with a head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the tree onto her face. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all these strange adventures of hers that you have now just been reading about. And when she finished, her sister kissed her and said, "That was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run into your tea. It's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well as she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still just as she left, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion, and this was what was her dream. First she dreamed of little Alice herself. Once again the tiny hands clasped around her knee. The bright, eager eyes were looking up at her, and she could hear the very tones of her voice and see the queer little toss of her head to keep track of the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her began alive with strange creatures of her sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of teacups as the mad hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the queen ordered off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while the plates and the dishes crashed around it. Once more the shriek of the griffin and the squeak of the lizard's slate pencil and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed with the distant sobs of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on with her eyes closed and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again, and all would change into dull reality. The grass would only be rustling in the wind, the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds, the rattling teacups would change to the tinkling sheep bells, and the queen's shrill cries would be the voice of the shepherd boy. And the sneeze of the baby, and the shriek of the griffin, and all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how the same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through the riper years, the simple, loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with a dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all the simple sorrows, finding pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and happy summer days. The end. Thank you all so much for visiting me on this journey down the rabbit hole. This concludes Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Please keep in mind all of the other wonderful things that we are doing here on both YouTube and also on our website, on our Facebook. We've got plenty of other stories coming up. And this week is National Library Week, so we are celebrating you being able to find your library in your place. And so that begins just some of the wonderful things that we are doing. Be sure to tune in on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 a.m. And tomorrow we are going to be beginning our journey down the yellow brick road in the land of Oz, thanks to HarperCollins. So we will see you again next week. In the meantime, have fun, stay safe.